June 30th, 2020. Before we get started, I did want to bring up a few housekeeping items, so just to make you all aware. First thing is, this will be a little bit different of a Market Matters segment. As is typical when we have guest speakers on, I'm going to do a more abbreviated version of the market commentary and market updates on the front end, and that's specifically so we can give our guest speaker more time on the back end. As well, similar to the one we did 2 weeks ago, we'd love this to be more of an interactive conversation. So for those of you that have questions, please use the chat feature on Zoom to lob in your questions throughout the course of the commentary or the program. And what I'll do is I'll either try to grab those questions as I'm doing the Market Matters segment, or grab them at the end there, and we'll try to address them all. And I think this one is particularly a apropos guest speaker today, because we were able to get on Dr. Patricia Meadors. She is an ER physician at the Piedmont Health System. And I think, as you all are probably aware, it's a very timely topic to discuss, given some of the dynamics that are happening, not only within health systems that we all are aware of, but also in the state-by-state approach that some health systems are taking, or health professionals are taking with addressing the COVID-19. So with that as some context, so as a brief agenda, what we're going to go through, as I mentioned, the brief economic and investment updates. And again, for this one, we're moving all the COVID-related commentary and data to the guest speaker section. So I think you'll find that very interesting. So let's talk about the economic and investment updates and where we are kind of mid-year in 2020. What you see on the screen here, this is our what we call our investment ratings. And for those that are just tuning in, this is kind of how we think about different asset categories or asset classes, where they are today, and maybe some what the orange box would tell you is where we used to have the rating and where we are today, with the arrow indicating where we are. So just a few items to note here. We made these adjustments, I would say, three weeks ago or so, maybe 4, where we downgraded our position to neutral with, I think, U.S. stocks, generally speaking, just using the S&P 500 as a proxy there. And the real primary reason for that would be valuation. As we all know, with earnings having taken a big hit due to the COVID situation, we're now trading at a pretty lofty PE ratio on the S&P 500 that would also describe or tell you how we think about things like mid-cap stocks or mid-sized stocks and small company stocks, all having very elevated valuations. The other item to note here, I think that's worth mentioning, is the fixed income side. Whereas a few weeks ago or even months ago, muni bonds were presenting a really attractive opportunity, not only on the taxable side, but also on the tax-exempt side. Those have become much less attractive as prices on those securities, generally speaking, have gone up. And, obviously the yield has come down. Now, what'll be interesting, and we'll touch on this maybe in next month's Market Matters, but I think the tax-exempt nature of muni bonds may end up getting more attractive, particularly if Democrats or Joe Biden in particular obtains president, rises and beats President Trump in the next presidential election. That's particularly because he's made no bones about it that he plans on raising tax rates back to levels they were prior to President Trump, or maybe somewhere in between. So that's something we're definitely going to keep an eye on and give you some updates on in the future. Okay, I think that covers most of what's on this slide. So let's turn to the next slide here. And this here are just some comments, I think, generally speaking, about where we think about the market, or some portfolio notes. As I continue to think, actively managing some of the risks in your portfolio is going to be very important to long-term return attainment, especially with valuations where they are. As you may all recall, we're continuing to increase what we call our dry powder, or really what it is just cash available for investment, even though it's not, cash as in, non-interest bearing money in the accounts right now. It's in the form of an ultra short ETF. So you should start seeing that in the accounts right now. But also a new comment I would like to make, and I've done a lot of work on this recently, is that it does appear that market volatility is going to be here to stay for a long time. equity markets are now one of the only avenues that investors or the financial system can express volatility in security prices. The bond market clearly is an area where the Fed is not willing to allow price volatility. Currency markets also might be lumped into that consideration as well too. Commodity markets have always been a bit of the Wild West from a volatility standpoint, but equity markets in particular are going to be, I think, the avenue to express volatility for most of the investment community. In that way, we should just prepare ourselves for more choppy waters ahead. On the equity side, certainly I think, as I mentioned, gains are going to be a bit harder to have from here, primarily because we've rallied substantially back off the lows, and valuation is going to be a little bit more tricky. But I think the good news is that if you're an active investor, the opportunity set is not only not bad now, but it's only likely to get better in the future, given the substantial amounts of volatility that we're expecting going forward. So if you're able to act on opportunities as they present themselves, whether they be fleeting or a little more persistent over a couple of weeks, and that'll be a good way to, I think, add incremental return to a portfolio in the future. Fixed income, as I mentioned in the comments here, it's getting back to Sily levels, meaning low levels of spread relative to Treasury, which ultimately means low nominal interest rates or just low stated interest rates or yields. And then finally, on the alternative side, I know in the conversations I've had with clients over the last few weeks, a lot of you are interested to know where we find opportunities. We continue to find opportunities in the private markets. That has a lot to do with the fact that a lot of hedge funds and private equity funds did a lot of forced selling in the March-April timeframe, creating some really unique opportunities, but also from a regulatory standpoint, there are some unique opportunities that will likely stick around for a while, relating primarily to Dodd-Frank and Basel III requirements for banks to hold more capital and lend less to more risky borrowers, as they would call them. So let's take a look at the equity markets. Just a brief snapshot. You can see after briefly going positive for the year in a small way back there in the early part of June, you can see we've trailed off here recently, and that just makes sense, I think, given where we come from, where we've gone to over this very short window of time. It's amazing how few people expected this to happen. I mean, as you may recall, we were very, I think, firm in our ideas that the pricing at the environment at the time was getting very extreme. Sentiment was blowing out, and that we thought there was going to be potentially a rally over the short term. That has pretty much come to I think realization. But going forward, I think our base case here, as I'll mention in the final comments, is that we're going to get a sideways market with maybe a slightly positive return for the year, if you can believe that. On the fixed income side, you can see, this is what I'm talking about, getting back to Sily levels. Corporate bond market is now trading in return for the year the same as the Treasury market, which I guess makes sense given that the Fed has specifically targeted the corporate bond market as something that they are unwilling to let go of, or unwilling to have as something that's going to be a risk on the table for them. So the corporate bond market is clearly an area that's done quite well recently. But interestingly, the junk bond market is that's the green line here. You can see is kind of trailed off from down only 2% to now down 6%, and I think that's one primary reason why we still don't find a lot of value in junk bonds right now. It's just not worth the risk to take right now. So here's just some key takeaways, I think, just worth mentioning. Sideways market would be our best estimate with the resistance, and I think we saw that when the S&P approached the 3,100 level. You do see a lot of resistance happening at that point, primarily because I think the valuation just gets to be quite challenging. Retesting the March low is getting less probable, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. It's not our base case anymore, but still, it does carry a fairly substantial weighting in our forward-looking forecast. We are building back portfolio resilience to be ready for any unforeseen risks that we see on the horizon or don't see on the horizon, so that we will be better able to react, not from a place of fear, but from a place of opportunity. And I think that's the key. And then more, I think recently, what'll be really interesting to follow is, technology has been obviously the leadership sector of this rally for the last, for 2020 particularly. As I showed you in the chart 2 weeks ago, the difference between growth, the Russell 1000 Growth Index and the Russell 1000 Value Index is a difference of somewhere in the neighborhood of, 15 percentage points or more. And I think this is probably going to persist, assuming rates stay low. However, you are seeing some targeted weakness in a few names, and I would say particularly keep an eye on what's going on with Facebook. Facebook is a name right now that obviously they've got a great business model, given they own Instagram, the Facebook messaging service, the Facebook social media platform, and a few other very highly valued properties, WhatsApp. But more recently, last week, you started to see some advertisers pull their commitments to Facebook advertising for a variety of reasons. But a lot of it has to do with policing hate speech and things of that nature, which will likely be ephemeral. But still, it's important to keep an eye on, because technology is what led us back out of the hole in March. And if that's not going to be the case from here, we got to understand what the leadership sector is going to be. And it's not likely to be financials or things of that nature potentially, but we'll see. So with that, I think that concludes some of the comments I had from a market and investment perspective. And I did want to make sure we left some time for a great discussion with Dr. Patricia Meadors. So let me see here, Dr. Meadors, if I can unmute you on my end. Maybe we have to, there you go. Dr. Meadors, do we have you on the line?
Yes, we do.
Oh, very good. Very good. Well, before we get going today, I did want to just take a moment here to give a big thank you to agreeing to show on our program. I know a lot of clients have been very interested in some of the content that we'll be talking about today. And also wanted to say, thank you for all the work that you're doing in the hospital system. I know you're kind of the front lines of the war against this virus. So just wanted to make sure we said thank you before we get started.
I appreciate that very much, Todd.
Absolutely. So everyone can see the screen right now. And I think your resume really speaks for itself, and quite an impressive career I think you've had in a number of different capacities within the healthcare system, which is, I think, what really, makes you able to speak to a lot of the questions that clients have been lobbing in so far. And I think if maybe we could start as just a general starting point. I understand, the comments you'll be making today will likely be, your own, not necessarily the healthcare system per se. But just give us a lay of the land from what you see from your perch, from the Piedmont emergency room system, and just some of the trends you're noticing on that front.
Well, first of all, we're part of a system. We have 11 hospitals in our system. And in general, in an average year, we see 650,000 ER visits. It's an astounding number of visits to the emergency room. We started seeing cases of COVID very, very early on. And initially, quite a few were older. They had more comorbidities. There was a higher admission rate, not only to general medical floors, but to the ICUs. We kept track. We had a crisis management team that was put together early on. So we kept careful track of our supplies, of where the patients were going, of how many were going to the ICUs, and what our mortality rate was, which was incredibly good. It was about 12% of all those admitted, which is an amazing statistic when you see what's happening elsewhere. We never really saw an actual fall to where we wanted it to be with, we saw a trend down, but we never saw a flattening of the curve either in the Piedmont healthcare system or in Georgia in general. And that leads to my newest comment, which is the last 2 weeks have been incredible. The number of cases are going up day by day. We've hit new records this week. The average daily cases in Georgia for the last 7 days through June 29th are 1,927. As of yesterday, there are 1,359 patients in Georgia hospitals, and the percent of COVID tests that are positive has also gone up. It's about 9% over the course of the last week, 13% yesterday alone. And this is not just because we're doing more tests. This is actual cases of active disease.
Right. That's staggering. I don't know if you can see on a screen in front of me. I'm showing the trend from April to, I think it's last Friday, and as you point out, it does seem like this is a pretty scary increase in the rate of infection. And I do appreciate your comment about a lot of what's being said in the media right now has to do with well, this is because we're testing more, directly relating to the reopening is really what's the cause here. Is that not what your thoughts are?
It's directly related. There's no doubt about it. When we talk to the patients that are coming in now, almost virtually everyone has been out and about at bars and restaurants predominantly. Very few protesters have come in. It's been mainly young people at bars and restaurants. They do say they wear their mask in, but they take it off as soon as they're seated at a table. So they admit they're not wearing it throughout their time out with friends. And there is not social distancing.
Right. Yeah, it's really fascinating. Maybe for the benefit of the group, Dr. Meadors, would you mind just giving us your thoughts on what's different about COVID-19 versus the normal flu or influenza? How do the symptoms manifest themselves, and where are really the chronic issues that might be fatal?
Well, it's a new disease, so of course it hits people harder because there's no natural immunity to it the way there is with the flu now. So the blunting of response is not seen. The symptoms are more generalized. It's not like an upper respiratory tract infection. The flu is like a bad upper respiratory tract infection. This is different. There are headaches involved. There's confusion. There's lots of complaints of muscle pains and GI symptoms. The pneumonia that we're seeing with it is unlike any other pneumonia. And we see viral pneumonia with influenza cases, but this is very different. It's a different appearance on chest x-ray and CAT scan. It causes hypoxia, which is a low oxygen level, sooner than that's seen with the flu. And more people are needing ICU care than we see with influenza.
Right. And I guess, maybe to that point, I recently read some of the updated high risk categories from the CDC, and they indicated a lot of, newer focal areas as we get to know more about the disease itself. One of them being, the nephrogenic system, which is, the kidney system, and the pulmonary system, which is a lung system. Is that consistent with some of the, chronic issues that you all are seeing as you intake patients?
Yes, it's very interesting how it's affecting the vascular system. There are more strokes, there are more blood clots. There seems to be a vascular permeability problem that we're seeing in the people that are in the hospital for a longer length of time. and is just a more generalized all system disease than you see with other viral infections.
Right. Right. So I guess that leads me to my next question, which again on the screen here I'm showing the COVID infection rates between the U.S. model, which was the social distancing, close the economy, versus the Swedish model, which was trying to build up herd immunity. Do you have any thoughts on if this herd immunity approach has any relevance, or is it something that's really kind of a fairy tale with this particular disease, in your opinion?
I think it's too early to tell that. I think herd immunity
Yeah.
is important. It's what we aim for with vaccinations in general, is creating a state of herd immunity. So you can get that
Right.
in one of two ways, basically. You can get it because you get the disease. You can get it because you're vaccinated against the disease, or in some cases, if you get convalescent plasma. We're not sure about that yet, but that's certainly an area of treatment that's being worked on.
Right, right. So I just got a question in the queue. Thank you, Bridget. Or I'm sorry, Bridget, about there's been, I think, some press out there about how an MMR vaccine may have shown or be showing some efficacy around protection, for certain individuals. Do you think, or have you heard anything that would address that particular topic?
To be determined.
Right. Right. Yeah, I would guess like most of these things, and probably why it takes so long for vaccines to be approved. Right. You just got to do the trial studies, trial and error to isolate, the effectiveness or the efficacy. Right.
Right. But it looks like we do have some promise with about 13 of the vaccine trials that are in existence right now. There are almost 130
Right.
endeavors at vaccination that are being worked on. 13 are a little further along in the process, and that's happened because government entities are working with private companies, giving both expertise and money. So that advances the process from a 5 to 10 year endeavor to an 18-month to 2-year one.
Right. Right. Wow. And I guess in your opinion, I'm not sure, how much you're familiar with, vaccine development, but is there any possibility that could come to market sooner than 18 months, or would that be more of like a specific label exemption?
I think it would be label exemption. I mean, there's some talk about more general use of the Moderna vaccine in January of 2021. It's entering phase 2 trials, part of whom are recruited from right here near Emory. So we'll see how it goes. Only about 10% of those that enter the approval rating to go into phase trials end up being low side effects and showing efficacy. So we'll see. They're still in phase 1.
Right. Right. So here's another question. If we've got a moment here from Tony. Thank you, Tony. Politics aside, from a medical perspective, do you think we need a coordinated, thoughtful, federal-led strategy to effectively fight this pandemic, or do you, in your opinion, do you think the state-led response has been the right approach?
I think the federal government should set the tone for how we approach anything that can affect the general population. And unfortunately, that is lacking. We do have some strong state leaders that have tried to set the pace, and they've been fairly successful in certain states at giving out a strong message that protected their citizenry. So absolutely, it needs to be a joint effort between the scientific community and government officials. Right.
Here's another question that was lobbed in from Mark. Hi, Mark. Thank you for the question. Does Piedmont know how many people who have been asymptomatic or light in symptoms but test positive are, I think it's sero protected, SERO protected? I'm not sure if you know what that means.
I do know what that means. And the way it works is most people we see have symptoms. We are not seeing asymptomatic people who want to be tested. Those may be going to the drive-through testing centers, but that's not who we see in the emergency room. So the trials are underway to, number one, develop the right test to test for antibodies. And we don't know how valid those tests are yet. There's some out there, but the validity has not been established. So you have to get a good test first. Then the second thing is, if you show that you have developed antibodies, what does that mean? Does that mean you are protected? How long are you protected? What is the level of antibodies you need to be protected? And those are questions that remain to be answered. Right.
Thank you for that. Here's another question that one of our listeners lobbed in here, and that is, how soon after exposure would someone test positive if they were exposed? So I guess, like, maybe said another way is, if you're in a social setting, what would be the earliest opportunity to be able to detect COVID-19?
48 hours seems to be the earliest time that we can detect a positive test after exposure.
Wow.
In a high-risk setting. And that's lack of social distancing and lack of masks. If you wear a mask, the data is very good, and you keep social distancing, you're really well protected. Right.
And this is an interesting topic as well too, because obviously we all see people that are in various states of mask wearing or not, social distancing or not. And I guess the question is, this is another one from Bridget, was that if I'm wearing a mask, but I'm talking to somebody else that's not, or they're in close by in proximity, is my mask helping me not get what they have, or is it really just helping others not get what I have?
It's really dual protection, but you've all seen those graphs on social media where the best end result is when both people wear a mask and are socially distanced. When one wears a mask and you're socially distanced, that reduces your protection, but still gives some protection to the mask wearer.
Right. And it's a fascinating kind of discussion, because certainly it does appear younger folks are much less prone to wearing a mask, I would say, than maybe older generations or people in their 30s and 40s. And I guess that just leads me to maybe a question for you, which would be, will this be something that, I guess, as a society we can tackle without, shutting the economy down and, making people, I guess, enforce the social distancing? Or is this going to just linger on until we've got a vaccine and, open and close? I mean, what do you think, in your opinion?
Well, if you remember around the discussion about mandatory seat belts in cars, there was a lot of discussion about how it would affect the car industry and the economy, and all that turned out just fine. I mean, ultimately, a vaccination is going to be the answer to this pandemic. All the treatment, viruses are very, very hard to treat. They're not bacterial infections. They don't respond to antibiotics. They don't respond to usual measures. Vaccination has always been the answer with viral illnesses. And until we have one, all the measures in the world are really not going to help the economy, because it's still, the answer is social distancing and mask wearing. That's very difficult for certain types of businesses to do.
Yeah. And I guess it's just one of those crazy things that we're all going to have to adjust to the new reality, right? I mean, that's kind of what you're saying. So just generally, I'm not sure if you follow what's going on in Asia or not, but certainly there are areas like Vietnam or I want to say South Korea that have had very, very low infection rates and very, very low mortality rates also as a byproduct. I think Vietnam has 0 deaths attributed to the disease, and this is in a country of 90 million. Do you see that as a direct kind of correlation to mask wearing? I mean, Asian societies being more adept because of the bird flu issues they've had over the years?
Well, I think that's part of it. I don't know how reliable their public health data is.
Yeah.
It's sort of hard to believe that there would be 0 deaths in a country with 90 million people. But I do think they are definitely more used to wearing masks. And they did have a brisk response a few years ago with the Asian flu. I also think their government is different. When they say you've got to wear a mask to go out in public, their community of citizenry does just that. We're a different country.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess it's no surprise we've got more infections in a place like Texas right now, where liberty is highly prized, whatever that means. So here's another one. This I think speaks to the chart on the screen right now, which is showing the 7-day average for new deaths in the state of Georgia. And you did touch on this a little bit, mortality rates in your opening comments. And, it's kind of been on this very gradual, it's even hard to see this downward trajectory. Is that still the case, or is this something where, as, infection rates are climbing, notwithstanding the fact of the new testing, but, more people are getting it as a percentage, is this likely to continue higher from a death rate or mortality rate standpoint?
You don't begin to see the deaths from the current infections for about 2 weeks. So we're seeing the rise in number of cases. The mortality data won't follow for another 2 weeks. So the difference is we are seeing more younger people infected now. And in general, they do not have the risk factors for severity of illness. So hopefully the mortality rates will stay lower than they were at the beginning of the illness. It's not in the viruses. Viruses need a host to replicate. They do not want the host to die, and they adapt fairly quickly. They figure out a way not to kill their host so that they have a place to live and replicate. So with most new illnesses, you see high mortality rates at the beginning for a variety of reasons, and then the death rate tends to fall. Right.
It's fascinating. Okay. Well, yeah. Thank you for that. So here's a great question from William. Thanks, William, for your question. Talking about originally, to try to flatten the curve, one of the main reasons that CDC and others gave for that goal was so that we wouldn't overwhelm hospital healthcare systems. Could you speak a little bit to that? How you all have adapted to that? Small changes you all have had to make to your business or your treatment methods to not reach that point of I guess full. I guess I don't know how to say it, but full capacity. Is there a risk of that? Yeah.
Well, one of the scariest things, if you look at Georgia, there are 230 hospitals in Georgia. We have about 22,500 hospital beds. But looking across the state, 96 counties have no ICU beds. So that means over half of our counties in Georgia have no ICU beds. That puts the burden on those who do. And we saw that reflected in our own system. Now, what happened at the beginning is people were terrified to come to the emergency room in the hospital. So elective cases were absolutely put at a standstill, and patients that we would usually see were not coming. Heart attack patients, congestive heart failure patients, stroke patients,
Wow.
mentally ill, patients with GI symptoms. So we were initially able to handle the volume of COVID patients because our hospital beds and ICU beds, which would normally be filled with other patients, were now being filled with COVID patients. You reach a saturation point, as Phoebe Putney did and Henry County did, where your ICUs are filled and your surge beds are filled, and then you have to call other healthcare systems and ask for their help. So Piedmont was very fortunate. Our ICU beds, we had about 83 at the onset of this, but we had a ward in the new building that we had the capability very quickly build out and gain another 20 ICU beds. And fortunately, we had very generous private donors who have supported Piedmont, who gave the money to outfit those beds over the course of a very brief period of time. So we added 20 ICU beds very, very quickly. They were not supposed to be up and ready until August, but we added them late April, early May. We were able to overfill those with people we took some patients from Phoebe Putney and from Henry County, plus some of our own, and very quickly filled up those 20 new ICU beds.
Wow. Wow, that's amazing that you all were able to pivot that quickly to address this ailment or this illness. Well, I don't want to keep you too long here. I do have maybe one or two more questions, if that's okay.
That's sure.
Okay, great. So one question that just sticks in the back of my mind, and like anything, things come in cycles, things come in waves. I mean, I think the last time that the U.S. as a nation had to deal with a pandemic of this scale was obviously back in 1918, that Spanish flu pandemic. I may be missing some smaller outbreaks, but there's been a lot written recently about how viruses, it does seem, and I've talked to a couple of epidemiologists about this too, is that how some viruses are becoming more resistant to antivirals and some of the more common treatments that we have available to fight some of these diseases. Is this type of situation, in your perspective or in your opinion, going to be something that's more prevalent as opposed to one in 100 years? It's going to be much more frequent in the future?
Well, I think there are a couple of comments about that. First of all, it's predominantly bacterial infections that we're seeing become resistant. That has to do with overuse of antibiotics, not taking the full course of antibiotics, and people living longer and having more comorbidities. Examples are the methicillin-resistant Staph aureus bacteria, the ESBL E. coli infections. They usually cause urinary tract infections, a couple of enterococcus infections that have become resistant, and then, of course, the rise in Clostridium difficile, colitis, and diarrheal cases. So those are very, very worrisome, and we've seen this in our lifetime occur, and it is going to occur more commonly. There are 50 million, it's unbelievable the number of pounds of antibiotics consumed in the United States every year. And they are prescribed for reasons that are a little bit questionable. In terms of the viruses, we've never had that many good antiviral treatments. HIV is certainly an exception to that, and that's because a community rose up in arms and demanded effective treatment. So that has been an absolute miracle advancement in modern times. And we hope the same. We've never been able to develop a treatment for the common cold. That's a great example of how we have just been able to advance. So we'll see what we can do for this particular COVID.
Right. Well, thank you for that. And then the last question I'd have here, and then I'll let you go. You've been very generous with your time. Again, I appreciate that. Would there be any final to share with the group, either around, treatments or how you all are handling this at Piedmont, and any I guess best practices out, just to reiterate some of those.
Well, I think for us as a community of people living together, please continue to wear masks and social distance. There's no question that it helps. It's part of living in a free society as you care for others around you, even not just those you know in your home and your friends, but those you don't know. So that's my number one takeaway message today is mask and social distance. Number two, 85% of people that get COVID are going to do just fine. They're going to feel bad for a couple of weeks, but they're going to recover and they're going to be okay. The other 15% are the ones we worry about. And we live in the hypertension belt in the South, and that's one of the biggest risks for development of severity of disease. And we have to think about that and be very mindful of our neighbors and what diseases they might have.
Good, very good. Well, I think what that about takes us to the end of our time. It's right at 2:45. I did want to just say, before I let you off here, thanks again for not only being on the front lines and helping people deal with this, awful disease. I think you're uniquely qualified to speak on kind of what's going on here and the way forward. And we really appreciate you being able to not only, do what you do for the community, but also spend some time with us and share some of your insights. So I wanted to say thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
All right. Well, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into our message today. I think we got a lot out of that discussion with Dr. Meadors. Our next Market Matters will be in 2 weeks, 2 weeks from today. So we hope you can join us then. And in the meantime, stay safe, social distance, wear a mask, and we'll see you on the other side of this. Thank you.